What's the one thing that would make a parent choose something almost unbearable for their child? Not out of cruelty, not out of madness, but out of a cold, clear fear that everything the family had built was about to disappear. In ancient Egypt, some ordinary families found their answer, and it wasn't one anyone outside their world would have chosen. Roman-era census records from Egypt survive in a form most ancient history doesn't. Household by household, name by name, written on papyrus and preserved by the dry desert climate, well enough to still be readable 2,000 years later. Buried in those records, alongside ordinary details of who lived where and who owed what in taxes, sibling marriage appears, not as a footnote about a single royal family, but scattered across entries for farmers, landowners, people who paid the same taxes as everyone else. In some documented areas, it shows up in a significant share of all recorded marriages. These were not exceptional people. They were not acting out religious ecstasy. They were managing property. Here's how the math worked. Imagine a family with a few acres of farmland, enough to live on, enough to pass down, but not much more than that. A father dies. His land, by custom, splits between his children. Say there are 3 of them. Each now holds a third of what their father held, still workable, still enough to marry well and raise a family on. But their children inherit too. Each of those 3 portions splits again, 3 ways, maybe 4. What was once a single farm is now 9 or 12 slivers of land, scattered across a village, none of them large enough, on their own, to feed a household through a bad year. The family that started secure is now, within 2 generations, holding fragments. Not poor exactly, but fragile. 1 drought, 1 bad tax season, 1 dead ox, and a sliver of land stops being enough. That's an illustration, not a census figure. But the pressure it describes was real, and it wasn't the only one. Now picture the other side of the ledger. A daughter reaches marrying age. She's given a portion of the family's land, or its equivalent in goods, to bring into her marriage. That's simply how it worked. She marries out into another household, and that portion goes with her. It doesn't disappear from the world. It just stops being the family's. From her father's perspective, watching her leave with what he spent a lifetime accumulating, the wealth is just as gone as if it had burned. 2 slow leaks, running at the same time. Fragmentation from below, through inheritance. Drainage from the side, through marriage. A family watching both happen at once isn't reacting to an abstraction. It's watching its future get smaller in real time. Sibling marriage stopped both leaks in a single move. The land stayed whole, because it never had to be divided by an outside claim. The wealth stayed inside, because the daughter who married her brother never carried anything out the door. No outsider family gained access to what the household had built, because there was no outsider in the marriage at all. This is the behavioral lens through which historians often read the evidence. Families who had decided, consciously or not, that the danger of letting anyone in outweighed any cost of keeping everyone out. Whether that fear was fully articulate or simply baked into how property worked, we can't know. But the pattern it produced is clear. And once you see it that way, the behavior stops being alien. Think about every institution, every family business, every political dynasty, every closed circle that has ever responded to external pressure by pulling inward. The mechanism is different. The logic is identical. That behavioral pattern, the closed system, the sealed circle, the calculation that outsiders cost more than their worth, is something this channel keeps finding across history. If that's the kind of thread you want to follow, subscribe. There's significantly more of it ahead. Which creates the obvious problem. If this was purely a property calculation, it should have been straightforward. But humans are not spreadsheets. The Westermarck Effect, the deep psychological aversion people develop toward those they grow up closely with, exists for a reason. Evolution spent a long time building a system that makes this kind of attraction feel not just wrong, but viscerally repulsive. 2 children raised in the same house, sharing meals, sharing chores, sharing the small daily closeness of childhood, don't grow up feeling that closeness as romantic. They grow up feeling it as something closer to the opposite. By the time they're old enough to marry, the very familiarity that should make a match convenient is often what makes it unthinkable. This isn't a rule imposed from outside. It's something that develops quietly, in the body, without anyone deciding it should. So a family that wanted this marriage wasn't just fighting custom. They were fighting something built into the people involved. So how did these families actually make it work? This is where the history gets genuinely uncertain. Historians still argue about the mechanism, and the uncertainty is worth taking seriously rather than papering over. One explanation that has been debated is that, in wealthier households, siblings may sometimes have been raised apart, separated early enough that the Westermarck aversion never fully developed. If 2 children don't share the same daily childhood environment, The psychological break may not engage as strongly. But that explanation has limits. It applies more plausibly to elite households with the resources to manage separate upbringings. For ordinary farming families, the same mechanism is harder to establish. What different arrangements, if any, existed at the commoner level, historians have not settled. Also worth noting, the census records showing this practice appear most frequently among Hellenized urban populations in Roman Egypt, not exclusively among rural farmers. The land preservation logic is the dominant historical theory. But Egypt's combination of legal, economic, and religious conditions may have made something possible here that neighboring cultures, under similar economic pressures, never replicated. What isn't debated is what the evidence implies. Whatever was happening, it was working, repeatedly, across generations. Biological resistance wasn't simply absent, it was being managed. And that means someone had to make this feel not just survivable, but acceptable. This is where the Ptolemies earn their place in the story, and it's not where you'd expect them. The Ptolemies were the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt before Rome absorbed it, and they practiced sibling marriage at the royal level for a recognizable political reason. Picture the alternative. A Ptolemaic ruler marries a daughter from a powerful noble family, a normal, expected move in most royal courts. That marriage instantly gives the noble family a blood claim to the throne, through the children it produces. Give it 2 generations, and that family has a legitimate hereditary interest in the succession. A rival court has been built inside the palace, without a single soldier involved. A dynasty that only married within itself closed that door completely. There was no outside bloodline to marry in, because there was no marriage that reached outside. No noble family could gain a foothold through the bedroom that they couldn't gain through the battlefield. But they didn't just practice this quietly. They built a theology around it. They linked themselves publicly to Zeus and Hera, to Osiris and Isis, divine siblings who married. The choice wasn't random. Both pairings already existed in the mythology their subjects believed in, on both sides of the cultural line the Ptolemies straddled, Greek and Egyptian. They didn't have to invent a justification. They only had to point at a story their people already knew and say, "We are that story." The message was explicit. The gods themselves married this way. To follow the gods is not transgression, it is consecration. Whether this royal framing directly caused ordinary families to accept or practice sibling marriage, historians debate. The influence almost certainly didn't flow in a straight line from palace to farm. But what royal theology does, when it embeds a behavior in sacred cosmology, is change the moral landscape. It makes certain questions harder to ask, and certain rationalizations easier to reach for. Religion, in this reading, became the mechanism that reduced cognitive dissonance at the top of society, and may have created ambient legitimacy for the same choice made further down. That's interpretation, not documented cause, but it's the interpretation the evidence keeps pointing toward. We will let you decide how unusual that combination, economic pressure, ideological cover, and institutional self-preservation, actually is. So did it work? At the level of power preservation, possibly. The Ptolemies held Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, generation after generation of the same family sitting on the same throne, without a single successful takeover by an outside noble line. Whatever else went wrong for that dynasty, that specific danger, the one sibling marriage was designed to close off, never materialized. For ordinary families, the picture is less clean. Those who practiced sibling marriage likely kept their landholdings more consolidated than those who didn't. That was, after all, the entire point of the arrangement. But likely is doing real work in that sentence. Whether the outcome consistently followed is harder to establish from the surviving records than the intent behind the practice. At other levels, the costs were real and largely invisible to the people paying them. Sibling reproduction carries biological risk. When both parents share a close genetic line, recessive traits that would normally remain dormant are more likely to express in their children. Picture a household that has lost an infant. Then, a few years later, another. In a village where child mortality was already a constant, grinding fact of life for every family, sibling or not, there was no way to isolate cause. No one was counting genetic markers. No one had a framework that separated unlucky from consanguineous. A mother mourning a second lost child had every reason available to her culture to call it misfortune or the will of the gods, and no reason at all to suspect the marriage itself. The cost was real. It was also, to the people paying it, completely invisible. There's a second complication historians have raised about the census records specifically. Some marriages recorded as sibling unions may have involved legal arrangements, adoption being one mechanism that scholars point to. where the parties were not biologically related at all. The designation brother and sister may sometimes have been a legal status, not a biological one, which means some of what appears in the record as sibling marriage may have been, in practice, something closer to a tax or inheritance structure wearing the shape of a marriage. And this is where the historical mystery deepens rather than closes. Other Roman provinces faced the same inheritance pressures, the same tax burdens, the same incentive to keep property inside a family. Yet the practice didn't take hold at scale the way it did in Egypt. Something in Egypt's particular mixture, centuries of Greek and Egyptian populations living side by side, a religious tradition that had already normalized divine sibling pairs long before the Ptolemies arrived, and a Roman administrative system that recorded households in unusual detail, created conditions that, as far as the evidence shows, didn't line up quite the same way anywhere else in the empire. Even after extensive study, historians still debate why Egypt in this specific period was uniquely able to sustain this practice at scale, while neighboring cultures under many of the same pressures did not go the same direction. What exactly produced it remains genuinely contested. Historians have spent decades trying to explain why Egypt specifically produced this, and they still don't fully agree. If unresolved, uncomfortable historical mysteries are your thing, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss where this channel goes next. Here is what the story actually amounts to. The institutions that lasted in ancient Egypt, families, dynasties, households, were the ones that found ways to keep resources, loyalty, and bloodlines inside a closed system. Sibling marriage was the most extreme version of that logic, taken to its biological limit. It worked, for a while, by the measures people at the time could see. It failed, slowly, by costs they couldn't. That trade-off isn't ancient. Think of a family business that has always promoted from inside the bloodline. A son takes over from a father. A nephew is handed a division he isn't ready for, simply because he shares the family name. For a while, this feels like loyalty rewarded, control preserved, nothing leaking out to strangers. Then, a decision needs expertise the family doesn't have, and there's no one inside the circle qualified to make it. The same closing in that once felt like protection is now the thing standing in the way of the business surviving its next decade. That's the same trade-off, playing out on an ordinary, recognizable scale. It's the same one made by every organization that has ever decided outsiders are the primary threat, that the risk of letting someone in exceeds whatever value they might bring. Founder networks that only trust their own circle. Ideological communities that have become too sealed to hear criticism. The specific mechanisms are completely different. The underlying fear is identical. Ancient Egyptian sibling marriage is not a curiosity from a stranger world. It's the most extreme historical example of a recurring human pattern, the point at which the fear of losing what you have becomes powerful enough to override the instincts that normally protect you from something worse. The question the history leaves open isn't whether that fear was understandable. It's whether, by the time you recognize it in yourself, you've already been paying the cost.